Our next speaker is Steve Diorio. Steve Diorio is Executive Director of the Revenue Enablement Institute. He is a leading authority on go-to-market transformation, sales and marketing, performance measurement, and sales enablement. He is the author of a book, Beyond E, How Technology is Transforming Sales and Marketing Strategy. Very happy to welcome Steve Diorio. Welcome, Steve. How are you?
Glad to be here, Bob.
Great. Well, I'm going to let you take it away.
Thanks. I've known Bob for 15 years. As Bob pointed out, I run the Revenue Enablement Institute. That's a bunch of academics and experts who have been working at the vanguard, world-class experts at how to transform sales. Most of them have 20 plus years of sales enablement experience, marketing technology, as well as access to just amazing research at the leading edge. What we're going to try to do here today is share some research I've been collaborating with the SMA on to try to give guidance to marketing leaders, managers, and effectiveness professionals on how they need to be adapting to the new environment. Specifically, we've seen a dramatic downtick in selling productivity as folks are reacting to this new environment of working remotely. And we wanted to give you some data that we've collected in the last 2 weeks, as well as insights from hundreds of conversations our faculty has been having with leadership teams. For example, we've been giving lectures to dozens of leadership teams at a time on how to adapt to virtual selling. We wanted to share some of that with you and then invite you to participate in the research. Bob and I and our faculty will be publishing a report in the next 30 days, I think, Bob, where once we get this tight, we really want to make sure that the membership has access to this. So that's the goal here. And in terms of what I want to cover for the next 20 minutes or so, again, we fielded research in the last 2 weeks to understand the impact, short and long term, of COVID on sales team productivity, managing people you can't see. The reality is only 6% of people in organizations were formally equipped for telecommuting. Obviously, sales has been a remote job, but when you look at some of the tools and capabilities that people need to lead in this environment, there's some retrofitting that has to go on. We want to help you understand what these early findings mean to you in terms of what you could be doing to adapt to the environment. We've come up with 6 preliminary steps that you might consider taking today to both maintain, but ideally grow. One of the silver linings here is once you release the constraints of geography, territories, and function, there are opportunities here to double down in terms of productivity, engagement, speed. And so we want to look at those things. And obviously, Bob and I are going to have a discussion at the end. So let's get into it. Let's go back to January. In January, we were still talking about the new buying reality. We were still adapting to digital buyers. 70% of the buying was on there, but the reality is only 6% of employees were formally equipped in terms of home hardware, PCs, access to systems, compensation, skills to do their job remotely. Now let's fast forward to what we're seeing when the pandemic hits. The first piece of data we've gotten is a 20% reduction in sales team productivity. So what we did here is we crowdsourced and right now it's in the low hundreds, sales leaders and executives across industries. We're going to drive it into the high hundreds and get some tighter numbers on this. But already the number we're getting across industries is a 20% reduction in sales team productivity. And again, a lot of this is adapting. Old school field sellers, not being able to go face to face and do what they've done their whole careers, different expectations from buyers, difficulties, and uncertainties. There's a lot going on driving that number, and we'll talk about that. But the net of it is, when you continue to crowdsource this number, the numbers we're getting across industries, and obviously there are people who are doing very well in the crisis, people who are pivoting, but there's a lot of people who are distressed in terms of our clients. So acquisition is down lower. The scarier number is customer retention. There's a lot of liquidity challenges out there. Companies are retrenching. Software is becoming discretionary. Budgets are being cut, and so 75%. And again, these aren't exact numbers, but this is not 2% or 7%. This is 25% and 77% of sales executives say they're concerned that 75% of their customers are at risk. And then in terms of cross-sell, a subset of those, our ability to cross-sell and upsell, in a SaaS world where so much of selling is actually happening in post-sale service and customer success, that's an issue. The other thing we're getting a read on, this is not going to be short-term. Folks, 97% of people are disrupted. Obviously, people who make toilet paper and hand sanitizers aren't, but 97% of us are disrupted. And the prediction is this is going to be a 16-month disruption. However, we're trying to get a lot more granular data because what we've learned is uncertainty about when is the bottom, when will it recover, and what the post-COVID economy is going to look like in terms of mix of digital and traditional. What's going to happen to these events? What's going to happen to travel? What's going to happen to buyer expectations? Are people going to go to offices? That set point is still unknown. And we will continue to try to get harder and harder data on that. But these are important because we can't get out of crisis mode and start thinking about rebuilding until we get to the bottom, at least where we believe we see the bottom. And a lot of organizations we work with are trying to figure out what this new set point is. I don't think I've talked to anybody in the dozens of conversations I've had in the last week who thinks that this is going to rebound back to what it was. So this is good directional information. What are we going to do about that? Well, there are 6 things I think about in terms of how to think about these findings. And again, they're not absolutes, but it's real time. The data is fresh as of Sunday. And so first, we are definitely at an inflection point, and there's no turning back. What we're hearing is a lot of things that were happening anyhow are going to come to a head and maybe go to a tipping point, or as Bob Kelly likes to call it, a shoving point. We're seeing definitely friction between an old school selling model, relationship-based, face-to-face based, and new school buying, where more and more of the buyers want to do things online. But the big part of that that's really coming through in the survey is they want fast and complete answers. They don't want it spooled out. And that's a big dynamic that's impacting productivity. We're learning, from work we've done with Vistage, that digital-first businesses, just like, at Y2K, folks who invested in a digital-first infrastructure are generally, not absolutely, weathering the storm better than folks who relied on face-to-face model. One of the big undercurrents I want you to think about is adoption of sales analytics, automation, AR, VR, 5G communications. They've been hovering, digital selling models, they've been hovering at anywhere between 6 and 12% for 5 years. There's no really good reason other than will and a business case that these technologies should not be more broadly adopted. And we think there's going to be a big inflection point where people are going to get serious now about using analytics to double down on productivity, speed, engagement, and response times. And lastly, and I think Bob talks about this a lot, we've lived with CRM for 30 years, and the general consensus is those assets could be performing better. And I think leaders in particular are going to get serious about getting higher returns on this asset. We're not hearing people are going to add technology number 7,052 to the tech stack. I think a lot of people are saying, I've got a lot of data, technology, and people. I want them running faster, specifically twice as fast. And I think that's a good call to action, because I think anybody who's been in sales productivity or sales ops knows that's possible. But it's really getting senior leadership on board that's been holding us back. And maybe this will be that inflection point. The other thing we're seeing is that people believe that customer behavior expectation change is the #1 productivity channel, specifically the speed and completeness of response, and that increased desire for personalized and relevant content, as well as preference for more engagement on the phone, which perhaps a traditional seller, old guard, may not be comfortable with. So again, loss of demand, uncertainty are big factors, but the number one driver of productivity, that 20% drop, was adapting to these changing customer expectations. And I don't think that's going to be a short-term phenomenon. The other thing is visibility has become paramount. Managing, coaching, leading, and measuring salespeople that you cannot see is letting us fly blind. And the top four impediments are visibility into buyer response, customer engagement, seller activity, pipeline health, and getting underneath the hood of the forecast commitments. What activity and response and data do I have that tells me this is actually going to close next quarter? So big finding here is the top four things that sales leaders want to improve productivity are visibility, 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 and visibility. And so everybody has access to customer engagement data. You don't need to buy new technology to get that data. What's important is to get that data into the hands of the leaders, as well as the frontline sales people at the edge of your organization to make a difference. The other thing is, and I think Bob says this best, people are resisting the urge to lunge for technology. We've got pretty mature stacks. Most organizations have 5 to 10 technologies and a mature CRM implementation at this point. And I think what people are telling us in the survey is they're looking for advanced data analytics and AI to serve as glue, to connect the dots, to make this stuff work better. I mean, I think the big perception out there is selling machines are race cars, and firing at 8 cylinders, going 200 miles an hour. And the reality is most of them are firing on 1 or 2 cylinders and just trying to outrun the other guy. Someone who's firing on 3 cylinders would be the fastest car in the race in many of the industries that I serve. And so using analytics as glue to connect the dots to double productivity, engagement, and speed, as well as visibility, is really the call here. And so that's an undercurrent that we're seeing. Last two things that we took away from this: uncertainty is the big risk. And you got to think about uncertainty in terms of your clients. Got to be empathetic to their concerns. Looks like 80% of the people you will call on any given day are distressed and not in a position to do business. Uncertainty and demand was highlighted in the study as the biggest risk to the revenue plan. But also we need to deal with uncertainty with our own people, morale, personal uncertainty about their role, about their career, about their pipelines. As a sales leader, we need to make sure that we're cognizant of those things and communicating and leading. And I know that Stanley McChrystal, who we work with, is giving an excellent talk in this session to talk about those things because he's lived that real time. And I think you can't ignore the uncertainty in your own people. In fact, it came up number 2 in our survey. And lastly, leadership is more critical than ever. In fact, General McChrystal says you must act. Hoping this will go away, hoping this will rebound to something like the status quo isn't going to happen. And whether you're distressed and just trying to protect what you have, or pivoting to get into the COVID supply chain, or exploring market opportunities, which a lot of people are doing, you've got to double down. You've got to act. And even if we're uncertain as leaders and managers about the future, we have to act. Disciplined, focused, and frequent communications, doubling down on that, are more important than ever in crisis. And at the end of the day, getting back to Bob's shove or the tipping point here, it's time for senior leadership to demand better return on data and technology and analytics than we're getting today. And that's got to come from the top. And there's a lot of belief that if that does come from the top, that's going to work. So what do we do about this? These are preliminary findings. I really encourage you to go to the SMA research website, give us your data, because the more data we get, the tighter these data points come in. And again, there's going to be a big report at the back end. I'm just summarizing this. But there's probably 5 things that you could be acting on or thinking about to maintain the productivity of your sales reps. First is speed, speed, and speed. Across a lot of dimensions. You need to accelerate communications. General McChrystal will talk about the need to talk every single day, top to bottom in your organization, even if it's for 5 minutes. Information has to cascade from the top to the bottom. It's a very fluid environment. People need to know that there's a plan, know they're part of a team, and that's a must-have. Daily communications, but also lead flow. Buyer expectation is that they're going to get a response fast and it's complete, and there's plenty of people to respond. And lastly, the half-life of a lead that's generated an opportunity that we can see using engagement data or data from our websites. It's 24 to 48 hours. If someone's in market and we know that, and we do, we got to get that over real time. There's not a lot of room for slack in the system. Second, tools. Now, again, I'm not advocating technology, but only 6% of employees were formally equipped to work from home. And when we talk about tools, we're talking about things like hardware, PCs, hardware to get me wired in to those legacy systems that I need to do my job. We've heard, call centers who have walked out over COVID and are moving home, and they're flying blind because they're working on 20-year-old systems back at the office. So basic hardware, basic communications. AT&T tells us that network activity has gone up 400% in the last 8 weeks, and specifically video over mobile is eating up half of the mobile bandwidth. And they don't think that's going to go back. So bandwidth, again, we're not saying pay their subscriptions. Also, obviously, collaboration tools, but more importantly, one of the number one findings is the demand for relevant and high quality content is there. So, sales enablement has to be part of this toolkit. Most organizations who need it have it. Whether it's being used and part of the system, that's something to think about. Visibility, we'll talk more about this. We have to stop flying blind. We've got to leverage the engagement data in our organization. And this doubling down and hyper-focusing, these are challenging times. 70, 80% of the people we talk to will be in distress. We need to husband those relationships and be empathetic, but we cannot waste precious selling time in an environment where there are so many headwinds on opportunities, leads, and accounts that aren't going anywhere. And we need to use this time where we have buyer attention to really build the relationships, because people are going to remember who was there. If your pipeline is wiped out, then build those relationships, because people will remember who was there during the crisis. And finally, running new plays. If you take a look at your customer journey, you're going to find friction points where the sales event is no longer there. The trust you need to build, we hear this a lot, the trust you need to build a relationship is no longer there. And we need to highlight those things and make sure that we're writing new playbooks to equip those things. So to recap, speed, think in 4 dimensions. Think about accelerating response to address new school buyers. They want answers fast. Stanley McChrystal says, accelerate the cadence of information flow, daily meetings with the entire revenue team. Information has to cascade top to bottom. The situation is fluid. Do a stand-up. Lastly, third, accelerate flow of information to reps at the edge. They need the insights that let them have the conversations. We need to delegate authority to them to make and give them the information to the right decisions at that moment, and follow up on buyer intent. We have data on who's in market. That's only 10% of people at this point. We want to make sure that we react to that real time. And there's some of the data. Tools, I talked about this. Every rep should have unified communications, bandwidth utilizations going up 5-fold, phone, video, communication hardware, tether into the mainframe. A lot of the apps people use to run are inside the firewall. Hardware is critically important. Collaboration platforms, and I'm going to argue, given the growing importance of relevant content, that recommendation engines, training, and sales enablement is part of the kit. Visibility, we have to stop flying blind. The top 4 things, ways that technology can improve sales enablement are visibility into seller activity, visibility into client engagement, visibility into account health. And what we mean by that is define a 10 in terms of customer health. Are they keeping their commitments? Are we engaged? Are they consuming our content? You come up with the criteria, but you should be able to quantify that using engagement data. And lastly, we are making commitments on our pipeline. We need to look under the hood and say, what's really going on in that account? Is that a real second quarter close? Are we really engaged? So look at the top 4 things there, and visibility. And we'll talk about getting access to that data. Everyone has it. We need to demand that we get our hands on it. And it's something you should be able to do in 60 days. Lastly, doubling down. If you do the math, 75% of accounts at risk and only 50% of them are available for software. That tells me that only 12% of the clients I'm talking to are in market. And I want to know the difference. I certainly want to be apathetic to the other 88%, empathetic. I mean, that's important, but sales time is precious and we need to double down. We also need to double down and demand double the return on growth technology assets, the data that we're sitting on top of, CRM, and the other elements in the marketing tech. And what people are saying is, I don't need another thing in the stack. I need analytics to connect those dots. And we'll talk about that just a little bit more. And we have headwinds. We've got to find ways to double productivity and engagement, whether we're in protect mode, pivot mode, or going after new opportunities in the crisis. Finally, run new plays. Think about your customer journey. Identify the hotspots where face-to-face selling has to be replaced with virtual interaction. Don't assume that old school sellers are going to be immediately comfortable with new school virtual communications. Replace obsolete activity models that are no longer relevant in the new environment. And most importantly, what we're seeing people is there's a lot of bad news out there, but when you go virtual, you release the constraints of geography, territory, and to some degree functional constraints. And there's no impediment to getting the right people on the right call to answer the question and move the thing forward. And so one of the things people are driving towards, which is appropriate, is sales development, using sales development, videos, training, certification, making your own video and test. And one of the things we want to encourage you to do is first, build out plays that plug the gaps and repair the spots in the journey where you need to move to virtual interaction. Don't assume that people are good at this. And then make sure that you connect the dots. A lot of people fall in love with sales development, but if that's not connected to the content warehouse, if that's not connected to the recommendation engine, if that's not frankly connected to coaching and performance measurement and activity measurement, then it's just in isolation. People have 90% of these ingredients. Again, this notion of connecting the dots is where we're going to fight our way through this. So we want to talk a little bit more about that. And my last picture I want to say is, look, we need more visibility, productivity, engagement, and speed. We all have a technology stack. It's founded on 30-year-old CRM implementations, and it's there to fuel action. And what we need to start thinking about is 4 things. People tend to overplay the notion of aggregating data. They make it more complicated, fancy, and they focus on one set of data. You should focus on the core 4 pieces of data. My big problem with analytics, and the folks at Wharton will corroborate this, is they let perfect get in the way of good enough. Every organization has a CRM system. Every organization operates on email and calendar. Every organization has a website and digital channels or marketing automation platform, and every organization talks to customers. Organizations with complex sales generally have some type of digital asset management, sales engagement, sales enablement, or content management system. These are all data. These are all data. Content consumption is dye in the bloodstream. It's a tracer bullet that tells us whether customers are engaging with us. And these core 4 pieces of information, at least email, calendar, content, and CRM, can be assembled within 60 to 90 days. Whether you use spit and baling wire, don't overcomplicate it. And what you need to do is use analytics not to do lights out stuff, but to identify opportunities and get them into the right people's hands. And there are 4 things that are doable. Most people are doing it within a 90-day time horizon while we're still in the trough here. One is, if only 12% of our people are in market and we know when somebody has buyer intent, let's prioritize those real time. Let's recommend the next best play for that situation, even if it's a distressed client. Let's recommend content, and let's quantify buyer intent on a scale of 1 to 10. By going to those core 4 data sources that we all have, CRM, email, calendar, and content, I can get an 80% good enough system, which is way better than flying blind. And also, we want to focus on speed. We want to get these leads there, 100% visible, optimized, and real time. The same applies to sales development. People tend to think about these 9 blocks independently. Most of these are capabilities we already have. What's really important is to connect the playbooks to the sales development, to the training and coaching, connect them to recommendations, make sure the best plays are in the library, and start to tie them to measurements of activity, performance, and account health. So this is preliminary. I've tried to give you a picture and some insights as to how to think about this. I hope it's helpful. The more data we get, the more Bob and I and our academic team will be able to give you tighter data. Particularly, I want to start to get better reads on when is the bottom and how these things vary by industry, so it's more useful. So I encourage you to go to the sales management website under the resources tab and provide us our data. You will get a full and exhaustive report. Bob can promise that. We'll probably get that out in 20 to 30 days. We want to be responsive. And again, the Revenue Enablement Institute, what we are a faculty of world-class experts. Our goal is to give the new generation of sales leaders the tools and skills that they need to build high-performing revenue teams. Everybody on our faculty is either a lights-out professor or somebody with 10, 20, 30 years experience working with organizations. We're trying to actually help. We teach, but we also do. And again, we're giving lectures on virtual selling channels, and our team can show you a lot of the stuff I showed you today. So feel free to reach out. At a minimum, we'll get you access to resources. And Bob, I don't know if I went over, but this is really important stuff. So I want to make sure that I have time for questions and a chat with you.
Yeah, that's great. Steve, thank you so much. Excellent material as always, and really appreciate your effort to boil things down to the most practical, most impactful things that people can do. So thank you. We'll move now to questions.